Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre,
hey, Michael, how are you
today? I'm doing
very well. How are
you? Things are exciting as always. That's an evergreen statement about the state of Bitcoin. There's always something exciting going on.
Something new every day.
Yeah, and we're getting closer to the end of the mempool crash course, and today we're kind of continuing last week's topic about kind of how Bitcoin sort of protects itself by its own nature from different kind of outside forces. Last week was specifically dealing with certain types of institutional corruption that can occur, and the way that Bitcoin actually makes it more difficult for dishonest institutions to be able to make use of it. And this next article we're reading today actually published the same day, June 29th, 2014. And it's an article called Bitcoin Shroud of Subtlety and Allure. The price was about $600 when this came out. And this, we'll get right into it, but this article is specifically looking at how Bitcoin has features about it that sort of naturally defend itself towards certain types of attacks. I think we could just hop right into this one. Attacks on Bitcoin. A successful attack on Bitcoin means attacking Bitcoin's value. There might well be a bug that could be exploited to put the network out of commission temporarily, but would soon be fixed, and then the network would be up and running shortly thereafter. To destroy Bitcoin permanently means to end the profit opportunities available with it, and that means either a malicious hashing attack on the network that makes mining impossible, or such a malevolent policy against Bitcoin trade that even the black market abandons it. Both of these require spending resources in proportion to the profits that Bitcoin enables. In this article, I will discuss 3 reasons why such an attack is unlikely to succeed: anti-fragility, subtlety, and attacker defection. The interplay of these 3 defenses make Bitcoin into a kind of wave that rewards those who ride it and drowns those who resist it. And I do want to point out, as like this article isn't necessarily trying to make a sort of cut and dry law of the universe that Bitcoin is truly impervious to attacks, but rather that these are all dynamics that, when we are assessing Bitcoin from an adversarial point of view, which is how you should always be thinking about Bitcoin by its very nature. When you're thinking about this, these are dynamics that are in play that should be considered to understand how such an attacker can actually do stuff. It might be the case that there are less avenues available with certain kinds of attacks, or certain incentives that exist that a sort of naive look at the adversarial conditions would overlook. And I think this article does a great job of kind of laying out some of these things that we should be considering when thinking about these adversarial conditions. Did you have something?
Oh, I just wanted to highlight that first part about it being fixed, right, when there's a problem with the network, because by my count, there have been 2 existential bugs that have appeared in Bitcoin. And the first one was that inflation bug, and then the second one was the database bug in 2013. And then by virtue of not just open source, meaning that there were immediately code patches circulating, but also by the decentralized node operators rolling back to the last known good version, that part of Bitcoin is, I think, underrated in terms of its resilience, and that just being open source alone is this massive advantage that Bitcoin has over every other monetary system out there.
Absolutely. I would point out that there have been other potentially existential bugs. So, for instance, there's the another inflation bug that I'm trying to remember the exact. I think it was around 2019 or so, but it was not exploited in the least. And this was different from there was an overflow bug very, very early in Bitcoin's history where you could potentially create basically infinite Bitcoin. And actually, there was sort of the existential bug, not anytime soon. It would take until 2140, but the one involving that required bit 42, where basically at the very end of the supply issuance, because of how the bit operators had been handled initially, it would actually reset. And so you would just get, over time, an infinite amount of Bitcoin. You would start again at the 50 Bitcoins per block subsidy, but bit 42 allowed a fix to that. But once again, these are things that make your point.
Yeah, and to me the funniest thing in the world is that the Federal Reserve has a GitHub organization. They just don't have any repos in it, which is it's like, why even have the organization? I guess they're just name squatting, but at least, put some kind of a symbolic, oh, we did an open source project here. But I just
think it's more honest, right?
Well, yeah, it's more honest, but it would be hilarious if the Federal Reserve was open source, and then you would see pull requests of like, hey, can we create $2 trillion?
Yeah, there'd be like flame wars between the people who want to stop the printing and those who want to accelerate the printing, and they would there would probably soon be a Federal Reserve code of conduct that like has to lay the ban hammer down on those who don't get with the program of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, they'll say, pull requests are not for debating Austrian economics. Okay, you have to be operating within a neo-Keynesian framework of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Otherwise, we're going to ban you.
Yeah, and then they'd also have to deal with people forking and just making their own versions. And I think if that happened, the most successful one would probably be the one that tended towards effectively just becoming Bitcoin. In fact, that would be a funny series of pull requests and a Git history of showing a refactoring of the Federal Reserve, technical infrastructure into Bitcoin Core.
But you know what would happen though, Michael, is that if you actually, in their deterministic build system, if your hash did not match the official Federal Reserve hash, you would have Secret Service agents showing up at your house. You cannot compile protocol incompatible software without being accused of counterfeiting.
Yeah, that's a good point. And until you get to the fully decentralized system, you would be issuing a currency that they'd want to ban, like they've done with the Liberty Dollar and other systems. So
anyway,
stick
we're
with
on a
Bitcoin.
Tangent, but yeah.
Stick with Bitcoin.
Yeah,
that's
Bitcoin's
the lesson here. So continuing on, the first of these, anti-fragility, is exemplified in the fact that malicious hashing is impossible up to a certain fraction of the network. Below the point that selfish mining becomes possible, additional hashes per second are almost certainly beneficial because they increase the security of the network. Any potential attacker, therefore, must weigh in the possibility that he may end up benefiting the network instead of destroying it. A similar risk accompanies a legal attack on Bitcoin. Bitcoin can adapt to half-hearted attacks. It would move deeper into the black market where it would become permanently strengthened. Furthermore, a legal attack could be easily corrupted into one that brings as many Bitcoins as possible to the government agents instead of one that destroys it. And we'll talk more about that particular dynamic later in the article. It says see below. With this, we've had some commentary on, the black market before, but I think somewhere where this does make a good point is that if you relegate something to the black market, it does not stop it. And in fact, the black market would inherently be in an even more adversarial condition. So it could slow Bitcoin adoption and make it harder in some ways. But the system itself could still develop actually even stronger defenses because of stronger privacy tools and key management and so on and so forth, that simply prohibiting it does not itself mean anything. And we've seen jurisdictions try to ban Bitcoin, and I can't speak to how Bitcoin usage continued on in that, but for the rest of us, it just made a clear point that, oh, you should probably have Bitcoin because tyrannical governments don't like it, and you want to be able to prevent money being seized from tyrannical governments. So it can create conditions where people by necessity have to build better tools than they would otherwise have to, and it also invites everyone else to recognize the value of what Bitcoin is providing, even if they are not themselves facing those same adversarial conditions at that time. And I also
agree with that.
I also think with the mining I mean, that really is just what a beautiful system that, below a certain threshold, if you are mining even maliciously, you are actually just benefiting the network and adding more levels of censorship resistance. Now, it could be the case that you are finding ways to if you have a high enough hash rate, there are ways to basically make it artificially more expensive for transactions to go through because you are attacking the network, and the transaction fee market responds dynamically to that. But you're also just, if you're not powerful enough to actually halt the network in various ways, you're actually just signaling to everyone is like, hey, pay a little more transaction fees and you will still get in, and there's more hash power that's creating larger proof of work to secure that into the future. So it really is elegant the way that Bitcoin itself, just by its own technical nature, is able to handle these adversarial conditions and create a sort of market anti-fragility.
Yeah, I think Bitcoin's basically like surrounded by markets, right? Like there's the fee market, the exchange rate market, the hash rate market, and I think that's just a result of how permissionless and trust minimized the system is, that it delegates all that out to competitive mechanisms.
Yes. And finally, I'd like to mention, because it wasn't mentioned here, but the nature of open source. In Bitcoin, it would actually be absurd, for instance, to use closed source wallets. In fact, this is a critique that exists even of some of the ways of doing multi-sig, where there might be a phone app that's closed source, but it's coordinating for open source stuff. But because there's like that one piece that's closed source, anytime that you come across closed source anything in Bitcoin, it actually starts ringing people's alarm bells. And so that open source nature, it builds on itself, where it becomes something that those those who want to protect their Bitcoin have more and more reason to want more and more open source, which in turn has more eyeballs and more potential for uncovering these types of bugs, or even in the case of something being exploited, having it all available for auditing when the time comes to go in and try to make a patch, which has certainly happened. There's been lots of software bugs, throughout time. And there's also, because of the open source nature, because of the cryptographic nature, that is to say that, things are just computer code and private strings of ones and zeros that are highly malleable into different ways of working. Whenever there's any kind of attack on a certain kind of key management system or a wallet, such as physical security issues that we've discussed previously, that tells the entire rest of the market, here are conditions where a particular set of tools falls flat. Therefore, what can we do to harden it for everyone else to learn from it? So there's constantly this learning experience going on for everyone in the market of, okay, so and so there was like a wrench attack. Well, if there was a wrench attack, there's a few things that everyone could learn. One, was it due to a lack of physical security? It's like, okay, well, outside of Bitcoin itself, physical security needs to be a part of how people interact with Bitcoin. So don't just leave seeds lying around. Also, put them in a safe place. Or, develop things like multi-sig. Or we're even starting to see now there are companies like AnchorWatch that are coming up with market-oriented ways of dealing with these kinds of situations, and these have just continued over time. Like everyone gets to learn from everyone else, and so those market conditions, it's full on all angles, and that's what a wonderful like natural anti-fragility that knowledge does not it's not only within like one place. Everyone, any improvement anywhere is an improvement for everyone, and any faulty code or operations or what have you in one location is also knowledge that is spread to the entire public sphere to be dealt with. And so, there's reasons to believe that Bitcoin security is something that can accelerate much faster than other kinds of Bitcoin computer security, for instance.
Yeah, and to me, it's interesting that at the end of the day, the social engineering aspect of it is the greatest vulnerability. It's the humans. It ends up not being the technology.
Yes, but even that, like outside of it, because Bitcoiners are actually kind of like most prone to it, on the one hand, there's a bigger arms race for it, but it also, I think, makes Bitcoiners much more hardened to the realities of the day. So, for instance, I would guess, I'm someone I just don't even answer phone calls if it's not from a number I recommend. Phone numbers are just it's a totally broken system. And I would guess that your average Bitcoiner is someone who, at the very least, is aware of that being an issue, is probably aware of SIM swapping attacks and stuff like that. Whereas the broader public, I would not guess, I would not assume the broader public to have as much of an awareness of these types of things. And yet, it's not just Bitcoiners that are falling prey to this. So that itself, I think, shows like while there is like a heightened reality of the arms race within Bitcoin, Bitcoiners are also more prepared to deal with what is really happening in the world and taking computer security seriously in a way that other people still have to catch up. Which I think really, demonstrates just how amazing Bitcoin is. You mentioned deterministic builds earlier. That's a very Bitcoin thing. The Gideon deterministic build system in Bitcoin, that was created by Bitcoiners to deal with specific problems in software development that Bitcoiners were most vulnerable to be thinking about. So yeah, the fact too that Bitcoin is always viewing itself through an adversarial lens also makes it always on the lookout for all of these things to be improving. So yeah, it's I just can't get over just how elegant Bitcoin is. Like watching all of these economic incentives come together, it never ceases to blow my mind.
Yeah, I agree.
Continuing on to the next of the three, Bitcoin subtlety. Bitcoin adoption happens one person at a time, and this is true for potential attackers as well as the rest of us. It takes an entrepreneurial mindset to be able to imagine what Bitcoin could become, given how comparatively small it is now. It takes time and meditation for people to take Bitcoin seriously because most of its value is in the future. By the time this happens, Bitcoin has become much more expensive than when they first learned of it. Thus, Bitcoin is protected from attackers by being initially beyond their understanding. When Bitcoin was very small, it was very stealthy and was completely unknown to the establishment. Now they laugh at it, just as it has begun to grow bold. Of course, we don't know who really dismisses it and who is deliberately trying to draw attention away from it. This, I think, is a brilliant concept that has, it's stuck with me since I first read this in 2014, which is the fact that with any attack, all of this stuff that we talk about is squarely within the realm of economics. And one of the key economic concepts in Austrian economics is the notion of time dependency, that actions take time, production takes time. All these things that we're doing in the economy is happening over time. And so I think the brilliance of this is recognizing the time dimension of wanting to attack Bitcoin. Because if it comes in the sense of you not seeing what Bitcoin is capable of, then you're not going to be able to. You're going to have a half-hearted attack on Bitcoin. It's going to be nothing more than words that just fall on deaf ears. Or if you do see that Bitcoin is going to be great, that's also going to have an effect. And actually, that side of it's going to come up in the next section, so I won't quite touch that yet. But do you have anything more on this subtlety?
Yeah, I guess in some ways, like it doesn't sink in, and I think the other pathology here would be when people attribute Bitcoin's success to themselves. It's like when people are like, oh, look, we memed a new global monetary system into existence. It's like, no, not really. I mean, how to put it, like, I don't want to give a sense of inevitability, but in a way, like, the credit has to go to the system, not to us.
Yes, I think that there would be some kind of path dependency that would it could be attributed to particular individuals. Like, someone had to be in Michael Saylor's ear for him to, he asked for it, to my understanding of the story, but someone had to be the one who actually communicated to someone like Michael Saylor, and that's true for literally everyone. And so I guess a path dependency is the wrong term, but there was sort of a path contingency of, like, things did happen in a particular order, and there were particular people who spoke to particular other people and had certain effects on them. And if you're God, you could probably you could sit back and see how all of that played out. But the reality of looking at it from the individual is it's very hard to suss out specifically how you in particular made the impact versus you having been better than much of the market at identifying a trend that was happening.
Well, I think that then that individual pride turns into, okay, we did it for Bitcoin. Now let's meme this other random token into being, the world computer or whatever. And that I think is like where it really goes off the rails.
Yes, which I guess, like, in this case, it's like if Bitcoin's subtlety, like, it's not just time, but it's like there's certain properties of Bitcoin that exist over time that allow it to grow. If you are trying to attack Bitcoin in the sense of trying to create a competitive currency that lacks those features, like we've discussed previously, it lacks maybe like literal features, but even more importantly, just sort of lacks the liquidity and real expectation of the liquidity to grow. That time spent trying to, quote, attack Bitcoin by creating your own thing is all going to kind of go to waste. And I mean, it is kind of astounding to think, as big as Bitcoin is now relative to where it was when this was made, just imagining how many resources were misallocated by people who we're trying to create the better Bitcoin or something of the sort. And, those people would not be happy with me characterizing it as an attack on Bitcoin. But it is fundamentally trying to get liquidity to move from Bitcoin to something else. That is to say, like, make Bitcoin less useful and less, liquid, and there's more. So it is a kind of attack. It's not the same as necessarily like someone trying to, nuke, mining centers or anything, but they might not like that characterization, but it kind of is, and it has not worked for those reasons. And if they had a different entrepreneurial mindset of, where Bitcoin might go, perhaps that would have played out very different.
Yeah, I agree.
So the last one, Bitcoin's allure. Furthermore, potential attackers are at a disadvantage for another reason. Bitcoin tends to oppose organizations rather than people. Even someone who stands to lose from Bitcoin by not reacting to it, such as a banker or government agent, stands to gain a great deal by buying now. Only the very wealthiest people might reasonably expect to be worse off attempting to buy up as much as possible now than if it were gone. This could happen if their attempt to buy caused the price to rise too fast relative to their ability to acquire additional Bitcoins, to the point that they ultimately had less influence over the future Bitcoin economy than they have over the economy of today. Thus, the agency problem with Bitcoin affects Bitcoin competitors as well as Bitcoin holders. Nearly any government agent who begins to see Bitcoin as a potential threat must also simultaneously see it as an opportunity. He too can invest in Bitcoin. And why shouldn't he? Bitcoin may be a threat to his livelihood, but it may well be making him an offer he can't refuse. How can an organization that stands to lose by the adoption of Bitcoin provide its members with a better opportunity for staying loyal than Bitcoin provides for defection? Even those who might resist the temptation to defect would have to think about the defection of his fellows. How quickly is adoption happening? Is there time to mount an attack before Bitcoin becomes too powerful? How easily could the resources for such an attack be amassed, given both the ignorance and treachery of the other agents? If such an attack would be unlikely to succeed, then buying now would be the only intelligent action. Regardless of whether he liked Bitcoin, it would be futile to continue pursuing a doomed cause. Potential Bitcoin attackers are in a prisoner's dilemma. In the same way that people cannot easily rebel against the king owing to a lack of coordination on their part, governments cannot rebel against Bitcoin for the same reason. The government puts the people in a prisoner's dilemma against one another, and Bitcoin does the same to government agents. Bitcoin is like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Bitcoin attracts inside men to act as covert saboteurs. There have long been predictions from both Bitcoiners and naysayers of impending government attacks, but I think there is a possibility that Bitcoin could win without suffering much resistance. Moreover, although I said above only that any legal Bitcoin attack could be perverted, the considerations discussed in this section tend to make such diffusion very likely. Bitcoin defends itself by being obscure, but once it has attracted someone's attention, its best interest is for that person to understand the logic presented here. For then he will also understand that his best course is to deny Bitcoin's threat to his superiors and quietly to become its willing slave. And, this is the other side of it. Bitcoin, because it's this economic force of nature, as soon as you can understand the trend, in order to attack it, it's like the classic line of like, if you shoot at the king, you best not miss. If you try to attack Bitcoin, you have to somehow come up with an attack that can truly destroy Bitcoin. Otherwise, you might just be feeding into it. And if that's the case, you have to be able to recognize that Bitcoin is as he said before, you have to see Bitcoin's potential to even know that it's a thing worth dealing with. And all of this, gives you a way to, probably, potentially make more off riding Bitcoin's potential and sort of giving in to Bitcoin than it does to waste the resources trying to attack it.
Yeah, it's fascinating looking back now that we've had, politicians like Senator Elizabeth Warren attack it. Like she characterizes the person who is either miscalculating the economics, right? So she doesn't realize how much better off she would be just adopting Bitcoin, or like the bribes campaign contributions that she's receiving are greater than like the expected value of promoting Bitcoin and adopting Bitcoin and all that. But I think it really shows also that you have to be a diehard ideologue for this to not apply. Like you have to be really ideologically motivated. And there's not a lot of people in government who are really that motivated. Most of them are just like collecting a paycheck.
Yes. So, even on the case of that, I saw a tweet from someone who had been in Washington, D.C. as part of a Bitcoin Policy Institute event that happened recently as of recording this. And they actually spoke to Elizabeth Warren staffers. And it sounded like there was great success in helping the staffers understand that what they were upset about was actually more the crypto world, because they sort of have a correct dismay with the state of things like FT and crypto scams and like all of that. And what they needed was just sort of an education of understanding what Bitcoin actually is and how it differs from that. And that actually seemed to have some effect. Now who knows if that in particular will change them completely. But you can imagine, staffers starting to understand that. And then, you can also imagine a situation like this where, Elizabeth Warren is wanting to, or some other politician is wanting to fight against it. But the staffers have started to see how it can benefit their own, political outlook, or, just even sort of, personal outlook, and see a future for Bitcoin, and maybe, not give in to Elizabeth Warren's or whoever their superior is. And that's like a real dynamic that exists. And, especially within a government such as ours, here in the US, those politicians, like, they aren't writing all of their own bills and like doing all the things. They have teams of staffers that they rely on. And so even if a particular politician has a certain view, there are ways in which Bitcoin can seep in and sabotage their ability to actually dislike Bitcoin. Another example is I heard on a podcast reference to a sitting U.S. senator whose constituency is not particularly fond of Bitcoin. So, I can have my guesses as to what kind of constituency this is. This person was not named. But that this senator has quietly expressed very positive statements, privately, about Bitcoin and being pro-Bitcoin. And so there you have also a funny thing where, politicians are still in various ways beholden to their constituencies, and yet the politician themselves is like, quietly behind the scenes questioning their constituency because they see Bitcoin in a way the constituency does not. So it also kind of goes the other way as well, from, people within government who can learn about Bitcoin being questioning the people who are not in government but have some sort of influence over their position. So it really, like, I think that's a great illustration of just how much of, Bitcoin is like Invasion of the Bounty Snatchers, and it's able to get literally everyone from all angles into a more pro-Bitcoin way out of that prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah, I think that it's also, in the judiciary, you also have the younger folks who are clerking for the judges. And so the judges are like, gray hair, late 70s. They don't know what's going on with the Bitcoins. But their clerks are coming straight out of law school, and they're like in their early 20s. And, it creates lots of great situations where obviously the judge is not going to rely on his own judgment or her own judgment. They're going to talk to the clerks and ask, like, what do you guys think about this? And you get the same kinds of outcomes where they're reasonable. And so even, like looking at Sam Bankman-Fried going to prison, if you'd listened to Elizabeth Warren, she would have said, oh, it's completely unregulated. What he did is legal. That's why we need regulations. It's like, no, what he did was illegal. And so he's going to prison, and it shows you don't need more regulation.
Right. I think this is what's brilliant about this is this article is over 10 years old, and this was written at a time that people, in a sense, more plausibly believed that the government would be able to shut down Bitcoin. I think by 2014, I forget if we discussed this on an early episode, but I think by 2014, things had already kind of proven that Bitcoin was big enough to be a real entity. A major signal for this, I think, was the shutdown of the Silk Road, and how Bitcoin had a very, very fast flash crash and then skyrocketed to new all-time highs after that. So even at this time, for those in the know, people who that obsess about Bitcoin, there could be a sense of, no, I think this thing really is good to go. But obviously the broader world has still had strong beliefs about government attacks. And even Bitcoiners, because they're thinking adversarially, they think in terms of, the ways in which governments can and indeed have in the past slipped into a tyranny and what that could mean for Bitcoin. But I think what was brilliant about this was just being able to, this early on, make a plausible case for why, while that's never impossible, that there are other incentives at play that have to be considered within that context. So, governments are not omnipotent. They still exist within the real world where there's scarcity of time, which, we talked about the time dependency of things. There's scarcity of resources. There's scarcity of personnel and political will, and so on and so forth. All of these things the government is dependent on trying to figure out to actually mount some execution of a dictate. And so this was able to show, it's like, okay, that none of that is impossible, that the government could do X, Y, and Z. However, while we're considering that, let's also consider the other incentives at play within that could actually soften the way in which governments try to mount attacks. And I think that's played out kind of exactly that way. There have certainly been different attacks on Bitcoin, and things have also been dependent on different administrations and their views of things. But there also are these undercurrents of change that happen because people start to be interested in Bitcoin themselves. And outside of government, I mean, Bitcoin's allure, consider that Jamie Dimon has been railing against Bitcoin for years, calling it, a fraud and so on and so forth, while JP Morgan Chase also still offers various levels of increasingly Bitcoin products, different exposures to ETFs for certain kinds of customers and so on and so forth. But what I always thought was funny was that very early on, years and years ago, when he was saying, Bitcoin was a fraud, he also mentioned that his daughter owned Bitcoin and how she always thought she was some kind of genius because she had that, and he thought it was silly. And the joke's on him, obviously. Like, everyone should have listened to Jamie Dimon's daughter instead of Jamie Dimon. But the point being that, this isn't even just to do with Bitcoin, like the government. Is just, institutionally within, the banking sector. There's an example of someone who's, one of the most powerful bankers in the world. And, his railings against Bitcoin can't even influence his own daughter, which is also going to change his own personal affect towards it. To some degree. Now he still has made comments that that would in turn like implicate his daughter into like criminal activity, which is kind of a weird stance to take. But I do think it does have an effect on this. And so even if like a staffer or a politician feels a certain way, let's say that their friends start to get into it. Well, it's like, do you have more to gain from being a hardcore ideologue stooge of the state, or do you like your friendship? And, we've seen lots of people, break up friendships over political stuff, but is Bitcoin, it's one thing when you have, some of the events that have happened over the past few years, but like, is Bitcoin something that people can believe strongly enough to be evil that they want to give up a friend? I don't know that Bitcoin actually has that same, it does have a subtlety where it's a joke until it's not. And by the time you realize it's not a joke, you're probably really into it. I don't think that people would like want, maybe their friend talks about it too much and that annoys them or something. But I think it would actually soften people. So this sort of effect, it's just like at all kind of like layers of our social fabric, this sort of thing can be happening. And the more it happens, the less politically viable it becomes to do anything about it. A final example on that, in case you have something else to add, is we see the way politically how things like housing and 401ks are seen as sacred. It's like, oh, the numbers must go up, and if your proposal threatens those, it's dead in the water. It's dead on arrival. I mean, you might be able to stir up some discussion about it and whip people up, like we've seen with talks of unrealized capital gains tax. But politically, it's something that it's highly unlikely to move anywhere. So as you have more people putting their retirement money and such into Bitcoin, or Bitcoin seeps into it, such as the idea that something like, for instance, Strategy might be entering the S&P 500, as these things happen, it literally just becomes like less politically viable to defect against that than it is to want to mount some crazy effort against Bitcoin.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add on Jamie Dimon was he was like, oh, I'll defend your right to buy Bitcoin if you want to, even if I don't think you should. And I think that highlights like
checkmate.
The problem for the bankers is not all of their clients are Keynesians, right? So even if it's 20% of their clients who like Bitcoin, they can't come out and speak out against 20% of the clients. If they lose 20% of the clients, the shareholders are going to be not happy.
Yeah, and then you think of with that, part of why they'd be so unhappy is how much would they be losing just in brokerage fees alone for dismissing that. So Bitcoin's allure is a really powerful thing, and I think people need to think deeper. I think there's probably so much to be said that we haven't even touched on about all of the ways that Bitcoin slips into the social fabric and becomes normalized, becomes more economically viable, becomes more easily to perceive as economically viable, and so on and so forth, that it can easily just becomes a part of everyone's lives. In some sense, you start to see it in, different, kind of pop culture things. Like, you could probably just, kind of mention Bitcoin. People know what you're talking about. It might still be more of a joke than like a serious thing. But there also are movies and such that make use of Bitcoin as a plot device, where it's just like, yeah, this is a part of existence now. Is like there's Bitcoin transactions happening, and that's I don't remember the details, but one of the Mission Impossible movies was like that. I think we spoke about that at a different time. It's like, these things just seep into the cultural consciousness, and as it also becomes a thing where people explicitly, start to realize that it's a better economic trade for them, that all of that just compounds. And so I think you're right. And people also just need to consider is like, how ideological are government agents truly? And from sort of like public choice theory and so on and so forth, it like might not be as strong as you think within, the general context. Obviously there are times in history that's different, and there are also reasons that we need to be on the lookout for the ways things slide into that. And then you also have just like major vibe shifts that happen very rapidly as well. So, did you have anything else to add?
Nope.
Yeah, so I think this is, it's a very short and sweet article, but I think it's held up tremendously well, given it's almost weird how little of a fight there's been in the broad scheme of things. And by now in 2025, as of recording this, we've run out of good like ideological opponents, as we've talked about before. Even like the savviest of the opponents tend to be people who just have a slightly different view of how this is going to continue rather than will it.
And I also feel like a lot of the opponents, they don't, I don't know if this is willfully or not, but I feel like they don't understand their own side. So meaning that they are spending lots of time and energy worried about privacy technologies, in the sense of they want all these systems to be complying with AML KYC. And so they want to shut down, along the AML KYC lines. And that's all they're focused on. Meanwhile, they're completely missing like the part where this is attacking the system as a store of value. And that part, I guess it's because they don't have our opinion of it, right? That they're like, oh, the thing that's bad about this is the criminals using it. I think for the most part, they earnestly believe that, and they don't think about it hard enough. Well, even if you did clamp down on the KYC AML and you made sure that all the on and off ramps, are all compliant and legal and regulatory and whatnot, this is still going to destroy the dollar. So,
I mean, people as much as people are they are upset about ETFs, Bitcoin treasury companies, these sorts of things. That almost goes to show exactly what you're saying. Is like, you can clamp down, you can have effectively paper Bitcoin, and everyone is still rushing to it, knowing full well what it is, because of the underlying economic properties of Bitcoin that they're trying to get exposure to.
Yep. And then the other argument would be that, well, okay, it's fine now, but eventually, when the day comes, they're going to turn this regulatory control over the on and off ramps towards preventing people from buying Bitcoin. And then my reaction to that is, okay, but then they'll get sued in court and they'll lose elections, which is what just happened, right? With Operation Choke Point 2.0 and all that stuff.
We also see, just how wildly successful the ETFs have been. BlackRock, can't get enough of it. Do they want to shoot themselves in the foot on that? it's not obvious that they would.
Well, and if you read their marketing literature, they're literally saying, we think Bitcoin has value because it's decentralized, because you can self-custody it because it's sound money and there's only going to be 21 million. So it's like
and then they start petitioning for like-kind redemptions.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I really think that they understand that to maximize the value of this opportunity for them, they need to lean into Bitcoin and the Bitcoin ethos.
Yes, and I also think, for those Bitcoiners who are out there trying to talk to people about these things and make a small effect on certain people around you, for people like that who are worried about, oh, Bitcoin is for criminals or whatever. Well, in the case of something like BlackRock, you can, there are ways of reframing the discussion completely and starting from scratch and looking at those same properties from a totally different angle and seeing how that works out for them. And then, bring up, how that relates to criminals of like, yeah, I suppose like criminals can make use of something, but actually here are the reasons why like you should want these things. This is just good for you. And you're not a criminal, because, having all of your, UTXOs publicly known also, lets people know exactly, certain kinds of economic activity. So it would make sense for people to want to be more private about which UTXOs belong to them and how they want to manage those UTXOs so that when they do spend, information about those UTXOs don't bleed into, reveal different bits of information that they want out. It's like if you spend $1 worth of Bitcoin from a UTXO that's worth $1 billion, the vendor knows that you had $1 billion. So some of these privacy tools, instead of trying to view them from a criminal lens, how about trying to communicate it to people in terms of a normal people lens, and just how it is completely normal. And I do suspect that a lot of these people would actually be able to understand that. They don't share their passwords. I don't know any of Larry Fink's personal passwords. I actually don't even know his email. So, presumably he'd also see some value in being able to, do stuff. And this gets into something else with like the Bank Secrecy Act, which is, that's not something that banks want. Certain banks would want it as a regulatory moat because they can afford to put up with it. But just a bank as a concept, just like as an institution, is not inherently interested in the Bank Secrecy Act because of how onerous it is to their operations. And so there's also ways in which it's very possible that rather than Bitcoin causing a sort of immune reaction by the government to just go all out monetary aids, and destroy itself and everything because it doesn't want Bitcoin to take over. Rather than that, it's very possible that Bitcoin's allure actually moves institutions more in the direction of wanting to roll back onerous legislation and regulatory regimes that have made their businesses worse off. Now that's purely speculative, and I'm not placing any kind of probability on that. I'm just saying that is a possibility, and if that's a possibility, then there's a wider range of incentives that we need to understand at play here. And for those who are trying to make their small, humble impact on the world, have those in consideration for a more creative set of tactics about how to communicate and teach about Bitcoin.
Yep, I agree.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me. Like I said before, we're getting close to the end of the mempool crash course. So next week is one of the all-time classics, hyper Bitcoinization. So I'm very excited about that one.
Excellent. And as we record, we're hitting all-time highs. So here we go. Hyper Bitcoinization is real.
It's happening. See, there's always something exciting going on in Bitcoin.
Yep.
All right. Thank you for listening to The Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring and studying the S&I archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide.